Scholars. All right, so today we are going to be doing a lesson that involves, it's actually going to be two lessons. The objective is going to be being able to divide a dividend with a decimal by a divisor with decimals. What this means basically is it means that I am going to be able to look at a number. The dividend is the number at the beginning of a division sentence, right? So in this case, 40, and I'm going to be able to divide it by something with decimals. So an example that I have here is thinking about if I could divide 4.2 divided by 0.7, or 4 and 2 tenths divided by 7 tenths. All right, and so there's a few ways we're going to think about this. The first way I want to think about it is conceptually. Like, what does this actually look like? So what we're going to work on is we're going to start with 2.4 divided by 0.2. So these slides, by the way, are going to be available to you so you can go through them at your own pace. I'm going to go through them a little bit quickly just because we've got a bunch of problems that I want to show you, but go through these at your own pace after this is done, all right? So what I've done here is I'm showing 2.4 because remember that that's the whole number, the dividend that we're trying to break up. So I drew one hole, I drew a second hole, and then I used 4 tenths, right? So this is 2 and 4 tenths, 2 holes and 4 tenths. And then the next thing I did is, again, I have my 2 holes, hole number 1, hole number 2, and 4 tenths, and I broke them into groups of 2 tenths because that's what my divisor was. My divisor asked me to break things into 2 tenths. So since this is 1 tenth and this is 1 tenth, this is 2 tenths, right? So I made groups of 2 tenths, right? And after I've done that, I've then taken it and I've said, okay, well, 2.4, I have that. That's the whole I started with. 0.2, or 2 tenths, that's what each of these little gray boxes is, or each of these big gray boxes, I should say. So to solve for the quotient, to solve for the answer of the division problem, I need to know how many groups of 0.2 did I make. And I can count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? So the answer to this is 2.4 divided by 0.2 is 12. Because again, remember I started with 2 holes and 4 tenths. I then, because the question asked me to break it into 2 tenths, I broke each group into 2 tenths. Here's 1 tenth and 1 tenth. Together, this is 2 tenths. And then I counted up how many groups I had, and I ended up with 12. All right? So there is another way to think about this, though, and I actually want to go through that with you now. So this is sort of like a trick. There's a couple things that we need to remember before we start this trick. The first thing we need to remember is that you can multiply any number by 1 and it will stay the same, right? So if I multiply 3 times 1, it's still 3. If I multiply 2 times 1, it's still 2. If I multiply an elephant by 1, it's still 1 elephant, right? If I multiply 2/3 times 1, it's still 2/3. The second thing I need to remember is that I can write a division sentence as a fraction, because remember, a fraction is just another way of showing division. So these are two things I really want to keep in mind as I'm doing this, and I'm going to explain why in a moment. So what I have here is I actually have that same problem that we just did. 2.4, or 2 and 4 tenths, divided by 0.2, or 2 tenths. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to rewrite it as a fraction. 2.4, and then instead of the division symbol, I'm going to make it a fraction over 0.2. So all I've done at this point is just change the form that it is in. I haven't done anything to the numbers. I just changed the form that it's in. And I did that using this rule that we talked about here, that I can write a division sentence as a fraction. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to use this rule here, the one that says that I can multiply any number by 1 and it will stay the same, but I'm going to use a trick. Remember that 1 whole is the same as 10 over 10, right? Because if I have 10 pieces of something and I eat all 10 of them, then I've eaten a whole whatever it is. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to multiply this by 1, which I'm allowed to do, but the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to make it look like this, multiplied by 10 over 10, remembering that 10 over 10 is 1 whole. So I'm not changing the numbers. Again, it's just a math trick. Think of it like a magic trick. I'm taking it and I'm changing the form, but I'm not really changing the number. So I haven't done anything yet. I'm just changing the way it looks. But when I do change the way it looks, when we multiply by 10 and we have a decimal, what happens is it becomes 24 over 2, because 2.4 times 10 is 24, and 0.2 times 10 is 2. So now I have the same idea, the same basic thing. I've just changed the way it looks. And now 24 divided by 2, because remember, again, now I'm going to go back to my first rule. I can write a division sentence as a fraction. The opposite also applies. I can write a fraction as a division sentence. So I'm going to turn this into 24 divided by 2. And so now that's simple. That's just telling me if I have 24 apples and I'm breaking them into groups of 2, how many groups will I get? And I'm going to end up with 12 groups, which, if you remember, is what we ended up with here as well, right? 12 groups. So that's the first problems. And I want you to be able to do that, and you can do that on, I want you to end up, I would now like you to look at this problem and see if you can solve it on your own using either of the methods that we talked about, right? And again, you can use this as sort of a step-by-step guide. I actually have that same thing here in these slides that you can go back to and look at. So go ahead and try to figure out what 2.4 divided by 0.4 or 2 and 4 tenths divided by 4 tenths would look like, all right? In the meantime, we're going to go on to another set of very, very, very similar problems where we're doing almost the exact same thing. The only difference here is that we are going to be doing it with slightly more difficult numbers. But I want to go through that process again. Again, we're just doing the divide a dividend. This is a dividend with decimals. It has decimals by a divisor. Here is a divisor that also has decimals. So the first thing I'm going to do, the first thing that I did in this case is I turned it into a fraction. I took it from looking like a division problem, I turned it into a fraction. I'm going to do that again here. So my 1.6 is going to go on top, and my 0.04 is going to go on bottom, and I'm going to have to put my fraction symbol right in the middle. The fraction symbol represents the division problem, or the division symbol, excuse me. 0.04. Now, the next thing that I did here in the original is I multiplied it by 1 by multiplying it by 10 over 10. So again here, I want to multiply it by a whole, by 1. And if I do that by multiplying it by 10 over 10, then what would happen is 1.6 would become 16, and that's awesome. And 0.04 or 400ths would become 0.4, because we're only multiplying it by 10, we're only moving it over 1 on the place value chart, or in other words, we're moving this, if you could think about it by like moving this way, we're only moving it 1. And so I still end up with a decimal, and that's kind of not what I wanted, right? The whole point of doing this was to make it easier for myself to not deal with decimals. So what if, instead of that, instead of multiplying it by 10 over 10, I multiply it by 100 over 10. 100 over 100. And why is this still okay? Because this is still just one whole. Yes, it's broken into smaller bits. It's broken into 100 bits, but it's still, you're still eating all 100 of them. You're still eating the whole cake. So in this case, if I do this, now my 1.6 becomes 160, right? Because it's moving over twice on the place value chart, or you could think about it going 1, 2, and you would need to add a 0 here. And the good news is that this also now has, and let me make the division symbol, but this also, is now going to be multiplied by 100. So it's going to move twice, 1, 2. It's going to move over 2 places in my place value chart, and now it's going to be by 4. Now I don't have any decimals to deal with. That's awesome. So now what am I going to do? I'm going to take this and I'm going to turn it back into a division sentence. 160 divided by 4, and you can use any method you would like to try to solve this. You could use standard algorithm, you could break it into groups, but I'm going to use just what I know about these numbers. I know that 4 goes into 16 4 times. 4 times 4 is 16. I'm going to bring that down. I'm going to subtract it, 0. Bring the 0 down. How many times does 4 go into 0? None, 0. 4 times 0 is 0. And I end up with nothing left over, and I can check it really quick. 4 times 4D is 160. So same basic idea that I did with the first one, just with slightly more difficult numbers. Here also, as you can see, since I have 2 decimals, I always want to look in my divisor. Since I have 2 decimals in my divisor, I'm going to want to multiply a problem like this, and I'll just really, really quickly get it started for you, and then I want you to go ahead and try to work on this on your own. If I have this, I would do 1.68 over 0.12. I want to think, well, what number can I multiply it by so I can get rid of these decimals? And the answer would be 1 whole, of course. But how am I going to write that? I'm going to write it as 100 over 100. So I hope that this was helpful for you. It was definitely fun for me, just because it's enjoyable for me to get to interact with you even in this minimal way. I miss you. I hope I will see you very, very soon, and have a good night.